All right, well, welcome back to part two of this first lecture series. I am Dr. Levi Armstrong. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist in private practice and graduate counseling professor here at Amberton University. This is the second half of the week one lecture, and really the bottom line purpose of this first lecture is to provide you a foundational knowledge of the biological basis of behavior, because really you don't have to be neuroscientists or even neuropsychologists or psychiatrists. By the end of this thing, what I want you to know is that the brain does some things and is related to behavior in some ways, and that without that knowledge, it's difficult to understand the DSM-5 and diagnostics of mental disorders. And so to jump right back in and to kind of briefly review, there are two parts of the brain that we are most concerned about as professional counselors, and that is the prefrontal lobe and the limbic region. The limbic lobe or limbic region is our emotional processing center of the brain, and the prefrontal is basically the brake pedal for our emotions. It's what allows us to regulate ourselves emotionally. One of the takeaways from this slide that I want you to have that we didn't cover last time is that there's what's called a bottom-up and top-down processing. Literally what that means is that there's a physical the top of the brain processes all the functions below it, and that the bottom of the brain allows the top part to process. And so in other words, your brain stem does some functions like respiratory rate, blood pressure, heart rate, things like that. It's what keeps you awake and alert. And without those functions, there's no such thing as math, which is a higher complex function of the cortical area or the top part of the brain. And so that there's a bottom-up type of processing. There's a bottom-up push to keep you awake. Now, as you move through the brain towards the middle, you get towards like the primitive part of the brain. It's the reptilian part, and that's the emotional side. And the emotional part of the brain is concerned about your survival. It literally wants you to eat, to rest, be safe, and to procreate. That's what it cares about. If you didn't have anything but your brainstem and this limbic area, you would literally be a reptile that is not using any kind of moral judgment or anything like that, and is simply reacting to its environment based on what allows it to meet those needs. What makes us human is this outer part of our brain, the cortical area, the top-down processing, and particularly the prefrontal area where our executive functions are, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Just as another quick review, the adult brain or the fully developed brain does not occur until about age 25, and really it's our prefrontal and our frontal areas that aren't fully developed until then. After about age 25, our brain starts to slowly decline and lose neurons, and that's normal. Now, later on we'll talk about dementia and different types of progressive dementias that cause more rapid decline of the brain and dying off of those cells. But after age 25, everybody on the planet, with or without any kind of illness, has a decline of those neurons, and that's normal. That's what's called apoptosis, and that apoptosis is that word's literally translated into programmed cell death. The neurons may die off, but the actual connections between the neurons tend to get stronger through adulthood, and that's where we coined the term wisdom. All right. What I want to kind of highlight a little bit more detail here is that, like we mentioned a while ago, there's a prefrontal area to the brain, there's a limbic region, and then there's also the orbitoprefrontal. The orbitoprefrontal is right behind your eye. So literally, if you were to remove your eye and look behind it, that part of your frontal lobe is called the orbitoprefrontal area. And that's the part of the brain that deals with things like social, emotional, attachment style, and emotional regulation. It's what allows you to put the brakes on impulses and anger and emotional impulses, especially as it relates to interpersonal interactions. So if somebody's driving down the road and they cut you off, that may make you frustrated, but you don't commit murder because your orbitoprefrontal area is functional. That seems a bit drastic there, but the truth is that your ability to behave and use appropriate judgment when it comes to morality, when it comes to dealing with stress related to others, comes from that part of the brain. And we mentioned it before in last lecture, but we're going to cover it again. But there are two parts of the limbic system that you absolutely have to know about. It's the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is, again, it's the part of your brain that's always scanning the environment. It is literally, if you've ever seen Inside Out, the cartoon, it is fear. It's the emotion of fear. Now, the amygdala is turned on beginning in utero, and it never turns off. It's always scanning the environment for potential threats. It is what starts the process of the fight or flight response, and that's via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA, and that's what allows us to regulate our physiological response to stress via the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So if you had just an amygdala and no orbitoprefrontal area, every single thing in your environment, whether that is too cold of a temperature or a loud noise outside or a cat walking down the street, across the street from you, every potential threat would turn that amygdala on and would cause you to experience panic and a fight or flight response. Now, obviously, as human beings, we cannot live a very productive life anyway with that fight or flight response always turned on. And as you'll see with some disorders like PTSD, that's what we find to be dysregulated. But because we can't live like that, we have to have our orbital-prefrontal area, this part of the brain, and its connections put the brakes on the amygdala, whereby we're able to make a judgment call and say, oh, that's just a cat, I'm not going to worry about it, I'll be fine. Or, yes, that is a threat, and I need to respond. With the amygdala, you have a direct connection, and it's localized almost immediately adjacent to the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part of the brain that consolidates memory. And the amygdala and the hippocampus work closely hand in hand because the amygdala is what tells the hippocampus what to remember. And again, kind of as a reminder from last lecture, every memory that's stored in your brain is stored simply out of survival. So in other words, your brain only remembers things that it deems important as it relates to your survival. That's why it's hard to study for tests that seem to be boring or contain information that's not particularly useful or practical. It's because literally the brain is having a hard time rationalizing its utility as it relates to your survival. So with all that being said, the amygdala and the hippocampus are working together to help you remember things that pertain to your survival, and especially as it relates to how you relate to other people and potential threats. a little bit more about this limbic system. There's quite a few different parts of the limbic system, but what you need to remember too is that the limbic system isn't just concerned about emotional processing. It's also a part of the brain that deals with learning and memory. And so when you think about learning, go back to operant and conditioning theory and remember that there's always a reward for some sort of behavior, or for something to be learned. There has to be a reward, and the part of our brain that deals with rewarding us is localized in the limbic system, and that part of the brain is what deals with dopamine and the chemical dopamine, and allows us to say, okay, well, this is really important for me to remember, because it gives me pleasure, or it protects me, or keeps me out of harm's way. And with that being said, the other parts of the brain essentially deal with different functions that are more what's called higher order or complex functions. So the parietal lobe kind of deals with sensory perception and spatial processing, as well as sensory perception. The occipital lobe deals with visual processing, and the temporal lobes deal with auditory processing, as well as storage kind of areas for verbal and visual memory. So as it relates to mental illness in adults, there's some good, just general things to remember as it pertains to psychiatric illness. Number one is that every psychiatric illness and its symptoms can be traced back to a dysfunctional area of the brain. And so depending on what the symptom is, it's going to make sense for it to be localized in one area of the brain or another. So, for example, we know that people who've had damage to their left hemisphere, like let's say somebody who's had a stroke, generally those people tend to develop more depression. People who have damage to the right hemisphere have more manic-like symptoms. If you damage the orbital prefrontal area, as we mentioned earlier, that's where you start to get more aggressive tendencies, personality dysfunction, mood instability, and so forth. And that kind of falls in line with the executive functioning impairment, which is damage to the frontal or prefrontal area. Now, that doesn't mean to say that every person with psychiatric illness has a easily identifiable lesion or brain damage, like on a brain scan. In fact, most people with psychiatric illness, if you looked at their brains in a brain scan, they would look normal. But it is the functioning of those areas that is dysfunctional, and that functioning is primarily chemically based, and that's why you can have those symptoms without apparent brain damage. Just a little jokes there, kind of dad jokes. Let's skip to neurotransmitters and basic psychopharmacology and psychiatric illness, and we'll probably end this lecture here with covering just some of the basics of what these neurotransmitters do and how they relate to mental illness. So you have several different types of neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers that are used to either continue a message from a neuron to another neuron, stop that message from a neuron to another neuron, or modify that message in some way and then continue it. So, for example, most dopamine neurons are going to continue messages. So if a dopamine neuron releases dopamine to another dopamine neuron, whatever message that initial neuron had will continue to that next one. As compared to dopamine to a GABA neuron. A dopamine neuron is going to send dopamine to try to continue that message. That GABA neuron is going to receive it, And because it's a GABA neuron, it's going to stop that message. And then it gets even more complex from there, and that's really oversimplification. But what you need to remember is that there are several different theories behind what causes psychiatric illness. One of which is the neurotransmitter theories, such as dysregulated dopamine, dysregulated serotonin, dysregulated GABA, and norepinephrine. And as you can see here in this not a graph, this pie chart, what you get, it's not a pie chart, whatever this is called, what you get is if you have too little dopamine, you're going to have a depressed mood. You're also going to have sleep disturbances and psychomotor disturbances. But you're also going to have apathy and executive dysfunction and fatigue. If you have too little norepinephrine, you'll also have these symptoms because norepinephrine and dopamine kind of work the same. And with serotonin, if you have too little, you're going to have depressed mood, sleep disturbances, and psychomotor disturbances. But also, you start to have appetite and weight changes, feelings of guilt, and possible suicidal ideation. And so if you're having these symptoms, it tends to be much more related to serotonin deficiency as compared to these symptoms, which are going to be more related to dopamine or norepinephrine deficiency. And this slide just kind of highlights what we just talked about there, as well with serotonin. And acetylcholine, we didn't talk about. Acetylcholine is important because as it relates to geriatric psychopathology, this neurotransmitter is implicated in dementia, and it's identified that the parts of the brain that produce acetylcholine begin to die off quicker than other parts of the brain in things like Alzheimer's. And so acetylcholine is what allows your brain to remember and to learn and to pay attention. If you don't have enough of that, you start to have memory problems, and ultimately, if it's because of the dying off of those acetylcholine neurons, then it's ultimately tied to a dementia. GABA and glutamate. So GABA is found all throughout the brain, and it is like a brake pedal for the brain. If you have more GABA than you have glutamate, or if GABA's winning in the tug of war between GABA and glutamate, you're going to be sleepy and tired. You're also not going to remember much. You're not going to be anxious. You're going to be drowsy and have balance problems and all kinds of stuff if you have too much GABA. As compared to glutamate, which is excitatory, and if it's winning the tug of war between GABA and glutamate, you're going to have seizures, you're going to have hallucinations and mania and anxiety. And we'll probably stop here for this lecture, as we'll come back to all these medications throughout the rest of the semester here. But just as a brief review, there are different types of medications out there that affect the brain. There are the antidepressants, which are things like Prozac and Zoloft and Effexor and Cymbalta, the tricyclics, and the MAOI inhibitors. So these are also used for anxiety, and in fact are more effective for anxiety than they are depression for the most part. You've got the psychostimulants and the non-stimulants. These are the medications used for ADHD predominantly. You've got the anticonvulsants or mood stabilizers or anti-epileptics that are used for things like bipolar and explosive anger and seizures, as well as depression. You've got the antipsychotics used predominantly for psychosis and for mania related to bipolar. The anxiolytics and hypnotics used for anxiety, panic attacks, and sleep problems. And then the cognitive enhancing, which is really misnamed there because they don't really work all that great, but they're used predominantly for dementia, and there's things like Aricept and Namenda. And then you've got other ones that are used off-label or on-label, like the carbidopa-levodopa combination for Parkinson's, or the cogentin used for side effects caused by antipsychotics. So for today, that's what we're going to wrap up with, and we will continue the lecture series next time, and hopefully we'll get this loaded up to the YouTube channel and get you on your way. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.